Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first session of our lysosomal storage disease data sharing workshop. And this webinar series is called Setting the Scene. We have an excellent group of presenters ready to share their expertise to help us set the scene for our future discussions on data sharing. My name is Kara Wiseman, and I work at the Orphan Disease Center, where I direct the Program of Excellence in Lysosomal Storage Disease and MPS Advanced Therapies. We are at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm honored to present my co-presenter. Go ahead.
I'm Krista Kazaza. I am the scientific director for the critical path for lysosomal diseases. We are one of the 27 consortia at the Critical Path Institute, and our overarching goal is to develop actionable solutions for drug development tools, specifically in the lysosomal diseases. Thanks,
Great,
Kara.
thanks, Krista. Yeah, and we'll be hearing more for Krista in just a moment. We are so excited to share this time with you and learning and this robust discussion that we hope to have. So let's get started. But first, a couple housekeeping items. All the participants have automatically been turned off for your video and your audio, but you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A button during the workshop. Please note who your question is for, and if it's an open question. And then after the workshop, and even now, we ask you to visit our workshop website. This is hosted on the Orphan Disease Center page, and the link is above. You can also give us feedback through this feedback form with this QR code. You will find on our website all the information pertaining to the slides that are being presented today, the presenters themselves, and video recordings of this information will be posted here at some point after everything gets uploaded to YouTube and then uploaded back over to here. So we can let you know via email when those are ready if you would like to watch as well. So we ask you to participate both now and through this feedback form and in the future. So we are looking for presenters for the rest of our workshop series as well. But I will get into that in just a moment. But at any point, the feedback is the most important part of this workshop webinar series. Understanding what's important to you, what other things that you would like to see, and how you would like us to pursue this work is the most important part, and we look forward to your feedback and your responses. So for this first one, setting the scene, the agenda is as follows. We're first going to go through our goals that we're doing now. Then we'll be hearing from our groups throughout the regulatory and professional areas. So we'll be looking at elements of data sharing, and then NIH policy, and then ethics of data sharing. Then we will go into a panel discussion, and then we will wrap up with future directions. So the goals and workshop for this, the timeline for this workshop is really just through the next 4 months. We are holding this only every once a month for 2 hours a month, and that gives us time to digest, reflect, and decide what we would like to do next. Now, the vision is to get a thorough understanding of the current approaches to data sharing within the lysosomal storage disease community through this workshop and related activities. And those related activities are the feedback aspects that we are looking for you to participate in. So the outcomes will include a creation of written materials where we'll provide sponsors, participants, and patient advocacy organizations that are involved in non-interventional programs from any sector. This is academic, nonprofit, government, or industry, including registries and natural history studies. And the idea is to provide and have an outcome of a case study toolkit for data sharing that will empower the formation of data sharing collaboratives and facilitate data sharing activities. So these are the sessions that we will go through. The next session will be about proactive data sharing, which is how sponsors will set up their activities before the study begins in data sharing. The case study number 2 will be session number 3 on April 28th, and how sponsors approach data sharing once the study is already closed or has begun. And then session 4 will be case studies number 3 on data sharing collaboratives. We will get into more of this later as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came into this area, what we do at the Orphan Disease Center, and where we're going next. So the Orphan Disease Center was created in 2011 by a family who was a Penn alumni whose family had been struck by a rare disease. They realized that these challenges were not unique to them or their family, and that the entire rare disease community really needed a support structure to understand the needs of patients and to facilitate funding and support services for research. So it was created to develop transformative therapies using platform technologies that can be deployed across multiple rare diseases. And we emphasize disorders with substantial unmet need, independent of their incidence, and strive to ensure access to patients of all populations. And we believe that being too rare or too poor should not preclude you from access to curative therapies. The Orphan Disease Center team is currently headed by our director, Eric Marsh. We have 9 people working with us now, and we all are experts in different areas and support different areas of rare diseases. We'll see some of that in just a moment. We are a patient advocacy organization in the respect that we do a research-based patient advocacy, which means that we work with the research enterprise, academia, government, and pharma, as well as patient advocacy organizations for a patient-focused, appropriate, timely, and barrier-free therapeutic development. And we involve ourselves in efforts and policies to advance therapies into clinical practice. And that's one of the activities that we are doing today. The program of excellence that I direct specifically works to fund research into this area, and over the last 13 years have invested over $11 million in 71 awards at 22 institutions, 6 countries, and 36 individual PIs. And specifically, when we fund research and we create research products, it is extremely important to us that all tools that are generated and the data that is generated from them are shared widely with the patient and research and medical communities. Here's an example of some of the work that we've done. Now, when we talk about the work that we do with patients, a lot of times we will have these open forums where we have patient advocacy groups speaking with us. And here's 2 examples. One, the Orphan Disease Center and Global Genes Rare Drug Development Symposium that we were holding yearly with that group. And in 2023, here are some photos from that time, as well as our $1 Million Bike Ride that we hold yearly. Both of these empower patient advocacy organizations to develop their own therapies in different ways and to help move them through the scientific and research areas. In the $1 Million Bike Ride, we actually both help families raise money for rare disease through the bike ride, and then we run that program for them, specifically focused on funding research in their disease area based on their own needs. And then we help to bring the experts together to do peer review on those grants and then fund those grants. It is an absolutely amazing experience to work with all these different rare disease groups. We actually touch somewhere between 50 and 150 different rare diseases every year. So we get a lot of feedback from people. And a lot of times that we are working with them and people will say to us, they want to participate in clinical trials and studies. And the 2 things that they had told us was that the first thing they really want is obviously treatment for their loved ones and for themselves. But the second most important thing is to move science forward and to potentially keep others from the same fate. So, however, in natural history studies and registry, the focus is specifically the future. People are honored and proud to have a goal of leaving a legacy. They have something good come out of that disease and that experience and the suffering that they've experienced, that they want to show that their time is meaningful, that they can potentially prevent the grief of others that come after them. But a lot of the unanswered questions for those participants were, how do we get the data out once we participate in these studies? Is it returned to us? Is it shared? How is it analyzed for future use? And how do we make sure that our contributions last beyond and benefit us and society? So we asked the question, how do we empower patients and advocacy groups to encourage data sharing? Another aspect of this is the Cure GM1 Data Sharing Collaborative. So subsequently, during this time and over the last 2 years, I have been participating with Cure GM1 in their Data Sharing Collaborative initiative. Now, this was brought together because they had the need to get data from natural history studies and registries so they could support their efforts going forward. Specifically, things like natural history studies that could work as a comparator arm for a placebo, instead of a placebo-controlled pivotal clinical trial, as well as understanding things like genotype-phenotype relationship and biomarkers, which we'll hear from a lot more from Krista and our speakers later. So as we worked through this, we realized about hitting the 2-year mark that we really wanted to start sharing that experience with others. We had learned a lot, and we realized that it's a lot more challenging sometimes to share data than it would seem, but if we had the right kind of infrastructure that we could show people how we did it, how others that worked with us from industry, nonprofits, and academia and government were able to take their existing studies and modify them to share, and how the collaborative came together itself as well, would be really useful for people. So that's where we went from there. So I'm going to turn this over to Krista now.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, I mean, echoing that, and in similar parallel and intersecting paths, obviously worked a lot with Kara from the onset of the pre-consortium work for the critical path for lysosomal diseases, also known as CPLD. And similarly, as I mentioned, our overarching goal is in fact to develop actionable solutions for drug development and drug development tools. And again, once those are developed, CPATH is able to make those widely available and shareable. And so when we had the initial discussions, CPLD has really focused on biomarker identification, and more recently in the identification of the link of the biomarkers to clinically meaningful endpoints. And doing so is imperative that we have data from multiple contributors. One, obviously, a very important collaboration with CPLD. It was, in fact, as Kara mentioned, the Cure GM1 collaborative, but also other patient advocacy groups, other registries, industry, and academics. What I felt was, probably the most frustrating, but really the impetus for working more strategically and integrally with Kara was the how do we encourage collaboration? How do we really allow for the optimization of data sharing to be able to, as I mentioned, create these actionable solutions? So go ahead, next slide, please, Kara. Displayed here is the what happened? I'm back to, there we go. Okay, sorry. Displayed here are the key stages from drug discovery to post-market safety monitoring. So it specifically highlights the development and approval for safety and efficacy, and in this case, the FDA, but we are obviously internationally working with global stakeholders. But this represents the FDA's role in approving or rejecting applications. And as Kara mentioned, and one of the key components of CPLD is biomarker identification. And biomarkers are, in fact, essential throughout this process. They provide the critical data on safety and efficacy, patient response, and really the decision-making process. Additionally, the importance of biomarkers is sometimes under-considered in post-market as part of the monitoring to detect unexpected adverse events that come into play in the drug process, which really it really is important to have those clinical meaningful endpoints. And why I mention this as I now go talk, specifically into what CPLD does, that is really at the crux of that, is that to develop these actionable solutions, we really need to have a comprehensive understanding of the drug development process, and in fact, how biomarkers and clinically meaningful endpoints are the essential part of the work that we do for CPLD. Next slide, please. So that, that is, again, we're our mission and vision for CPLD, which is very similar to many of the consortia at CPATH, is to advance the medical product development in this case, in lysosomal diseases. Next slide, please. Specifically, our CPLD's objective is, in fact, you really have to advance the drug development, pioneer these actionable solutions. What does that look like? Well, it includes the identification of potential biomarkers, as well as linking them to clinically meaningful endpoints, in this case, clinical outcomes assessments, followed by other solutions like clinical trial simulation, disease progression models, and these are then presented for regulatory endorsement through that process that we just mentioned. But as is very clear to everybody on this webinar, I'm sure, is that to do any of that, to accelerate any aspect or to even engage in any aspect of that drug development process, we have to have the comprehensive data repository. So within that, we at CPLD and the other consortia at CPATH have a data analytics platform that's the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data Analytics platform, and that is going to allow us, specifically at CPATH, to create this comprehensive database. And this includes longitudinal, interventional data, registries, observational real-world data. And so, excuse me, as we launch as from the pre-consortia to the consortia stage, we have specific working groups that will specifically not only take what is in the literature and publications, but enrich what we have in the literature and publications with this real world data. To do that, we are dependent on the data that is shared within the RDCA DAP, as well as the registry data and observational research that is part of what we're really focused on, and that's the data sharing aspects. Next slide, please. So, within that strategy, in order to understand the understanding, in order to enhance the understanding of the physiology and the direct link that will allow for regulatory endorsement, we are exploring clinical biomarkers dependent on a specific context of use in diagnostic or tracking disease monitoring, evaluation to therapy, and then expand that linking to COA resource. And that collectively will allow us to advance these solutions. Again, the underlying essential part of that is the access and the sharing of data, that not only once it goes into the RDCA DAP is CPLD able to begin this process of interrogating the data, but it also RDCA DAP is publicly available. And there's other, we don't have to have all the data in the DAP, but the underlying message here is the sharing of data allows us to advance drug development across all of the lysosomal diseases and potentially multiple lysosomal diseases at the same time. Next slide, please. So here, in fact, is sorry. Here, in fact, is the standard drug development pipeline, and in the context of lysosomal diseases, biomarkers, again, are particularly crucial for measuring disease progression, treatment response. And, this includes all the standard drug development timeline, from basic discovery or preclinical to developmental research to market authorization, again, and post-marketing, as I previously indicated. Overall, the standard drug development timeline, as you can see there, is 12 to 15 years with over 1,000 patient volunteers. Now, the orphan drug, next slide, please, I'm sorry. The orphan drug regulatory pathways allows for fast tracking of the designation request, the breakthrough therapy design designation, as well as accelerated drug approval. Next slide, please. So when we overlay the standard timeline and the rare drug development timeline, biomarker identification is even more essential because of the unique challenges associated with the diseases. 12 to 15 years is not an option. 1,000 plus data points or patients is not an option. In lysosomal disease is another rare disease. The critical de-risking aspect of drug development requires expediting access to these life-threatening or life-changing therapies for patients and the unmet needs. The image also is really important here, that it highlights where natural history studies can substitute for placebo controls, which are often impractical or unethical in rare disease trials, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And the genotype-phenotype relationships identified during the natural history registries are also predictive and predicated on the ability to stratify patients by progression response to treatment. And so overall, biomarkers help assess the exposure, distribution, the mechanisms, and even early identification of responders versus non-responders. And these biomarkers are then used in regulatory submissions as surrogate markers to predict long-term clinical benefits. So the qualification process could be a little bit different in this rare disease drug development timeline. And you see the inclusion of the breakthrough therapy, regenerative medicine, and accelerated approval pathways, all of which require strong biomarker-driven evidence, obviously that requires quality data across multiple domains because of the uniqueness of the rare disease process. And so the emphasis here is placed on the role of registries, natural history studies, and patient-reported outcomes in rare disease development. So with that, I am going to allow Barbara Buehrer to set the scene and give an overview of data sharing elements and considerations. Barbara Buehrer is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the faculty director for multi-regional clinical trials at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard. Go ahead, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Karen, Krista, and it's a pleasure to be here today and be able to share this with you. So can you all see my slides and they're okay? Hearing nothing, I will continue. So thank you again. Here is my disclaimer. I am not speaking on behalf of anybody else but myself, even if I think that others should agree with me. And the MRCT Center itself is supported by voluntary contributions, as well as by grants, and you can read those on the website. Thank you for inviting me again. What I thought I'd do, Krista gave a really wonderful understanding of what the uses for data sharing would be and why it is so essential that people consider data sharing. What I'd like to do is sort of bring us back before we go forward to think through why data sharing and what are the risks and benefits of data sharing. And of course, that very much depends on what data you're about to share. So we've done a lot of this work at the MRCT Center, which is an applied policy center and research center focused on addressing the conduct, oversight, ethics, and regulatory environment for clinical research around the world. We do that by pulling together patient advocates, investigators and their research team, CROs, industry, regulators, and nonprofit organizations to really think through emerging issues and to develop together a focused and possible practical solution, thinking that if that solution or approach is acceptable to all, it's much more likely to take hold and be viable. And we've been working on data sharing and data privacy for many, many years now, and really have an understanding of how challenging this can be, knowing how important it is. So I'm going to talk about the ethics of data sharing, but not really, because Allison is going to follow on later today and talk about that, the framework for data sharing considerations, protections and repositories, and preserving trust and autonomy. And just to say, this is entirely my perspective, as a clinician and as somebody who has thought about this a fair amount. And we are really looking at non-interventional studies, including registries and natural history studies. But in order to think about that data, which is largely observational and contributed data, we're also going to think through what the differences are between the different kinds of data that we will be talking about. So here's where we're going to go, and this is my impression, and sort of think about this. I think that the individual owns their data, their own data. Institutions, pharma companies, investigators are stewards of the data and should be good stewards of those data. But the individual from whom that data comes, it really does own their data, and the choice of the individual should be respected and prioritized. That's complicated because, we don't want biased data sets. We want data sets that are representative of the population affected by a disease. But on the other hand, we have to appreciate that people come from different places and will have greater or lesser comfort in sharing their data. Having said that, protections should be in place for data that is shared and consistent with the individual's expressed different preferences. In other words, if they are happy for their data to be used to investigate, lysosomal storage diseases, for instance, but not some other diseases, we should have the mechanism to be able to assure that to them. I think that we should assume that all available data are essentially identifiable, and risk minimization, data minimization is a principle, and risk minimization. In other words, you should be sharing that data that is necessary for the purpose and not everything about somebody unless it's necessary for the purpose, and we should be thinking about how to minimize risk. And I also think it's possible to create infrastructure such as repositories, secure compute platforms, to achieve the goals and values of data sharing without unreasonable risk, and given the intent to respect the decisions of the data contributor, in other words, the individual. So while if you were able to download all the data, essentially for free, that becomes readily identifiable. If you can protect that data, even the same data, in a secure compute platform or in a repository, the risk of re-identification is essentially diminished. So why do we do this? We do it really to advance individual and public health as rapidly and safely as possible. If we have the data in a biobank or a data repository and don't have to collect it, we speed the discovery and can move forward more readily. Data sharing is making research available to other investigators, researchers, and the public. And it enables new discovery and new research questions by allowing more scientists to use and combine existing data. And it validates findings of individuals, individual researchers that have made their data available so that they can reanalyze and review prior results and extend those prior results. It also prevents unnecessary repetition and burden, the risk and waste to additional patients when the data already exists. Why collect it again? Why put people through that data, data collection if the data already exists? There's reasons to believe in rare diseases particularly that more data is better and that we will get a better sense. But for very common diseases, we should be able to advance based on common data sets and accrue new data over time, but not prevent the analysis of the data accrued to date. And it makes the best use of participants' volunteerism and contributions and of society's investment. It enables research using traditional and modern big data methods. For the latter, one needs data at scale. So for the big data, which is not really what we're talking about today, you really need more data, bigger data, and representative data. So the ethics of data sharing for secondary research, I'm not going to go into this as Allison will, but I really think it's grounded in the same essential ethical principles that we have lived with since the Belmont Report and now reaffirmed in the Declaration of Helsinki. There's respect for persons and communities, beneficence. You'll do, the intention is to do good and not to do bad, non-maleficence, justice, fairness, and equity. Again, you're all familiar with these, but I do think it's important to remember that this is the framework from which we are emanating the framework for data sharing. So in thinking about data sharing, data sources and expectations, we're going to talk about each of these: identifiability and value, certain consent issues, the population and the setting, the trust and transparency, and other considerations. So we will go through each of these, and if I forget, please remind me to come back to some of these issues in the discussion. So if you think about it, each of these, the data sources, identifiability, consent issues, populations, trust and transparency, they exist on a continuum. There isn't a right way and a wrong way of doing things. It's more risky, less risky. It's more more data and more valuable data versus less data and less valuable data. This is all a continuum. But these, I'm not going to sit here and say there's a right way to do it and not, because it very much depends on the setting. And of course, as you think about each of these sort of axes of consideration, you get not a singular linear sort of representation of that continuum, but really a very robust sort of complicated network or patchwork of different considerations. And I think the answer is that, it really does depend on what we're talking about. Are we talking about sensitive data that people would not want anybody to hear about? Are we talking about something that everybody knows and that is publicly available? Is there a risk to the person or not? No risk to the person. So each of these are going to be considered in time. But I do think that the answer, it depends, really does sit well with me, although it's a sort of non-answer, because very much this depends on the setting and the situation. So let's talk about some of these. So first of all, the data sources. So depending on the data source, individuals have their own expectations of privacy. If something is publicly available, it's on an online search, Wikipedia, or observable behaviors. How many people jaywalk crossing a street, or how do people hold their coffee cup? There's no expectation of privacy in that case. People are used to having publicly available data, and that, for the most part, is also true with social media. Certain things one really assumes are going to be more or less public. You don't, and what you post on something like LinkedIn or Facebook, you have a certain control over the privacy settings, but in general, that is not considered a private platform. There are some social media websites and groups where there is an expectation of privacy. Those are often patient advocacy groups, for instance, where there is a commitment when you enter that space that you will respect the confidentiality. But again, it's not like going to the doctor's office. There are data that are presumed to be private, like texts or emails, but may or may not be private in the end because they can be forwarded as well. And then there's data that is legally private, such as the medical information, electronic health records, laboratories. And in the US, once that data leaves the medical setting, the HIPAA, HIPAA covered entity, that data is considered identifiable in the US for research only if that data is readily identifiable. In the US, not in the EU, India, China, and elsewhere, de-identified data can be used without additional protections. It can be, in other words, waiver of consent can be introduced, and the individual may or may not know how that data is being used once it's de-identified. And then there's use of data that for which there has been consent for the use, where somebody knows that their identifiable data will be used because they've been told and they accepted the purpose for which it was going to be shared. So very different expectations. And as you get to more private data sources, the expectation for getting consent or for people to be aware of how their data will be used increases. So why do we care about data privacy? Well, first of all, there are expectations of privacy and confidentiality that are generally assumed on the part of participants and on the part of patients. And that can be more or less important to people depending on the nature and the type of data, as we've said. The risks of re-identification, sometimes there is no risk to the re-identified depending on what kind of information it is. But for some, such as sensitive information for which there is stigma attached, insurance implications or employment indications, that becomes quite concerning for people. And indeed, in the last month or two, we're seeing greater hesitation about sharing certain kinds of data than we had previously. And the risk, oops, wait a second, I went the wrong direction. And the risks are not only to the participant, but also to the family and the community. If you have genetic predisposition to disease, it implies, even if it's not known, that there is a risk in the family as well. And some sensitive information will specifically implicate the community in a certain way. So on this, if there is public information, we try to keep it anonymized. And that, is a greater sense of security that you will not be re-identified. If it's pseudonymized, that is generally considered identifiable in the EU. And here we have something called de-identification, where we strip information from the data so that it's not easily identifiable. But trust me, much of this is identifiable, particularly if you're able to triangulate this data with other data sources. So what is de-identification? It's where there is a code linking your information to yourself, but the direct identifiers, your name, social security number, IP address, etc., are stripped from from the data set. Synonymization is something where you process personal data in such a way that the data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject without the use of additional information, so long as that information is kept separately and subject to technical and organizational measures to ensure non-attribution to an identifiable or a person or an identified person. It's introducing a certain sort of hatch, a certain way of obfuscating the data, keeping its original relationship to each other, but making it, changing the dates, but changing the dates in a way that makes it harder to identify, but that one date still relates to another. And anonymization is really information that doesn't relate to an identifiable or identified natural person, and they're rendered anonymous in such a way that the data subject is not or no longer identifiable. But if you do that in the extreme so that you really can't identify somebody, then you're stripping a lot of the detail from that data that makes it readily useful in scientific investigation. So in general, this should be, there's an axis from identifiable data to anonymized data. And anonymize, you really decrease the risk of that data, but you also decrease the utility of that data. And when you have identifiable data, you use, it's much more useful and the risk is greater, and the individual sensitivity to its use is much more personally fraught. And where people feel that they should have control, I believe they should have control. And we should be getting consent if we can. Certainly, that's true with identifiable data. And then there's all the middle in between. So you should get consent here. And when we're talking about data, we want it in the end to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Those are the fair data principles, and I think that the maximal utility of the data comes when you can find it, access it, you can use it in various ways, and then you can reuse it as well. But it's very hard here to think about how to move from anonymized data to some level of de-identification, where you're going to future-proof the re-identification, where something that is anonymized today will not be anonymized tomorrow. That's now true with AI being able to link many of our data sets, that this becomes a much more challenging situation. So data sharing consent, again, a continuum where there's no consent to some consent and or actual specific consent. Can you consent to broad data use from data that you contribute today? I would argue you can, but you should appreciate that your situation, the individual situation, may well change as time moves forward. So what is a continuum between no consent and consent? Well, first of all, there's waiver of documentation of consent, where you have the consent process, but you don't document that consent. That makes it hard in the future to know what was consented or not, but it is a robust consent, and we use it under certain circumstances. There's waiver of consent where an IRB reviews or an oversight body reviews how that data will be used, but we're not going back to the original data contributor to ask whether or not we can use the data. We're just letting a hopefully disinterested party make the decision. And then, there's also notification and education where we're not actually asking people to consent, but we're telling them how we're going to use the data, that we're planning to use this for future use, for future research and education. But people don't necessarily understand that in detail. So it's worth thinking about how much we educate and notify, and I believe we don't do it well enough. So the importance of consent relates to the nature of the information that's collected, stored, accessed, and shared. And we can talk about specific examples of that. Of course, even if you have consent, the utility and the robustness of the consent really depends on somebody's comprehension and whether they understand fully what they are consenting to. And we know that consent is fraught. We know that people do not understand necessarily what we tell them during a consent discussion, even for interventional research. So hoping that they understand this, and then that they continue to remember that consent discussion going forward is challenging. And that's particularly challenging, in my opinion, when you say, well, you can always withdraw your data. Somebody has to remember that they have that ability at some future time, and the data that has been shared at that point can no longer be withdrawn. Let's talk about the data sharing population and the setting. So we've talked about the risk of re-identification in terms of insurance and stigma, and other risks to sharing to being re-identified. But there's a difference, if you've got hypertension or weight problems or whatever, it's a very common problem. And you won't necessarily be identified based on that. If it's a subpopulation, it gets more possible if you know that you're one of the few people who were, cured of a disease through one mechanism or another, that becomes more readily identifiable. But actually, in the rare and ultra rare disease, the risks of re-identification are greater. That is not only because of how we as scientists and researchers protect the data, but also because of how participants will share aspects of their own lived experience in social media and other public spaces, which makes it easier to re-identify because you can link that data to other data here. So we have to be thoughtful about what we ask of ultra rare and rare disease patients, and how we protect that data and what access we give to it. And really have a robust consent process if we are going to think about it. The vulnerability of the population is obviously important. And there are children or people with intellectual disabilities, prisoners, where there is real vulnerability in and of itself. And when we share data about children, even our own, realize that that will potentially follow them the rest of their life. And at 18, when they have the ability to consent again, that may or may not, be able to pull the cat back out of the bag. And I should have said unmet medical need as well. And then there's the choice, and how much autonomy does somebody have in their decision making. There's independent people who are perfectly capable of making that choice and deciding. It changes a bit when there is a guardian or a legally authorized representative that's representing the interests of the independent person. There's supported decision-making and surrogate decision-making, and that there the choice is the independent person when it's supported decision-making, but it is the decision maker is the surrogate when they have lost the ability to and the capacity to consent. The risks, all these risks are, of course, balanced by the value and utility of the data. And it's important to remember that we need to integrate data over time and across geographies. The natural history and epidemiology studies are absolutely dependent on data sharing. Long-term observational trials are only possible, and you can have assembled cohorts as clinical research opportunities, so that you already have the potential group from which to offer clinical trials as the clinical trial itself arises. So there are lots of really valuable uses of this information as it is collected, and particularly if it's collected in a way that is relatively considerate of the need to protect the identifiability. So the data sharing and protections, what can we do? First, data minimization, share what you need to answer the questions, respect fair principles, which we discussed. I think there are many things we can do in terms of specifically protecting the data. Encryption is one of them. We should be transferring data that is encrypted and not accessible in the pipe in which it is being transferred. I don't think many of these data sets should be downloadable and freely accessible unless they're fully consented. And that itself brings up other risks. There should be some level of control over data access so that we know and have a process to validate who is coming in to access that data, depending on, again, the risk and the consent. Often federated data systems are quite useful, and there should be an available secure compute environment should somebody wish to do something that may be risky for the individuals. I think the ability to withdraw, and then there are data use agreements, material transfer agreements, and oversights of that process that's also important for data protections. I think it's important for people to have the ability to withdraw the data, although I think that is difficult to do. And I think that we should have much stronger penalties for misuse of the data than we have at the moment. And then there are data and biospecimen repositories for which there are requirements for the data deposition. There are data release requirements, in other words, a process before you release the data to anyone or someone. Oversight of that of the repository, and then operational transparency. In other words, it's clear how people will get their data in and get data out of the repository, and people can analyze it and see if they're comfortable with it. Why do I say that there's a benefit to a secure data enclave? First of all, it can be accessed from anywhere. It's scalable. There's secure access to data-rich repositories, the ability to import data, to collaborate within the enclave without bringing it back, and then use of common statistical and data science software. So lots to consider on what can we control to make it safer. But then we get back to sort of, with all of this, what about informed consent? What should a participant have to or should know? So typically the elements of consent are already significant. We have the title of the investigator, the study, other identifying information, a clear expectation of the study purpose, the participant selection criteria, a description of the procedures involved, if it's interventional, not if it's not, potential risks, discomforts, and benefits, alternative options to participation, costs and compensation, including subject injury, the return of results, including individual results, the future use of that data, information about confidentiality, withdrawal and termination, consequences of withdrawal, should you be withdrawn or withdraw yourself, and a statement confirming voluntary participation. All of that already goes into consent for interventional trials and for largely repositories. But so we're already asking a lot. And principally, as we said, the individual or the LAR must understand the information and be able to make an informed decision. So when we're consenting, you'll, particularly for future use of the data, you'll see IRBs very concerned about including a long description of what the, risks and benefits might be. And certainly, we can talk about this in terms of how you think about it in interventional research and whether it should be a requirement or whether it's ethical to require future use of the data in a therapeutic trial, but that's another story. We worked hard to find language that we thought was generally acceptable and that wasn't too long. And this is what we came up with. I'm sure it can be improved upon, but it reads something like this: to advance science, medicine, and public health, we might share information about you from this research study with other researchers, but only after personal identification that may identify you has been removed. Your information may be combined with other people's data and or placed in a repository for future research. Some repositories are freely available to anyone. Other repositories may only be accessed by scientists who have permission. We protect your privacy by removing any identifiers, but despite our best effort, there is still a small chance that you could be re-identified, and that chance might be higher for patients with rare diseases. In the unlikely event that we learn of a breach of confidentiality, someone from the research team will contact you with additional information. If at any point during or after the study you think that you may have been re-identified, please contact us and let us know. So you can see how this touches on many of the things we've been talking about, but truly, can be adapted and adopted for future use in many different settings. So basically, individuals, community, society, and public should understand what's happening to their data and biospecimens, the risk and benefits of data sharing, the protections that are in place, and the ultimate value of the contributions. Individuals should be offered the option of sharing their data in a way with which they are comfortable, and that's the responsibility of the research and care ecosystem. And with that, thank you, and I look forward to questions anon.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was really a wonderful, inclusive presentation. Very grateful for your insight in this area, and I look forward to our questions. So now I'm going to turn us over to our next presentation. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, great. So now, unfortunately, we were not able to have our NIH representative here today to give us this presentation, but they have provided us the opportunity to go through some of their material and put it together. So unfortunately, this won't be as deep of a dive into this policy, but we will have some information for you, and questions can be sent to NIH as well for any clarification. So like I was saying, the material here has been obtained from publicly available information on the NIH website, linked or related publications and videos. Everything that's in this presentation has been documented, and there's links to where this information was found. Any changes from the publicly available data was only made for formatting or streamlining purposes and did not change content. All this information will be here for you. And again, if you have questions specifically on this, we'll do our best to answer them, but we ask that you also email sharing@nih.gov. Now to get started. So the NIH has a longstanding commitment to making the results of research available. So the data management and sharing policy creates a consistent minimum expectation for all research supported by the agency. The scope of the policy is all research funded or conducted in whole or in part by NIH that results in the generation of scientific data. So that is defined as the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications. But it is not including things that are data that is not necessary for or sufficient quality to validate or replicate those research findings. Your laboratory notebooks are not included. Now there are preliminary analysis, completed case forms, drafts of scientific papers, plans for future research, peer reviews, communications, and physical objects. The activities subject to the data sharing and management policy applies to all research generating scientific data. That is including but not limited to research projects, certain career development awards, small business, SBIR, STTR, and research centers. But it does not apply to training, fellowships, construction, conference grants, and resource grants with these specific codes. Again, please see this, the links that will be attached and that are available for you on our website. So the submission of the data management and sharing plan started with January 25th, 2023. So everything from then on in or forward is then compliant, needs to be compliant with the management plan. So just really quickly, I wanted to put some information here about how it would be different than before. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but just it's good to have this information if you are funded prior to that and you're looking at data that had been created previously and where does that apply. So the elements of the data sharing plan are data type, related tools, software codes, standards, data preservation, access and timelines, access, distribution, reuse considerations, and oversight of data management and sharing. And that plan and compliance is going to be monitored and managed by whom it needs to be specified within that data sharing plan as well, or data management and sharing plan. So the NIH program staff will ensure that the elements of the plan have been adequately addressed and that assesses the reasonableness of those responses. Applications will only be funded when the plan is complete and acceptable. So peer reviewers will consider if the budget for that aspect is also reasonable. Monitoring compliance of that is done through, first, the approved plan becomes a term or condition of the award. Then grantees report progress of an approved data management sharing plan in their RPPR, which is the Research Performance Progress Report. There's annual, interim, and final. And then the NIH reviews compliance annually with that plan. Now, failure to comply may result in an enforcement action and affect future funding decisions. So when you're sharing scientific data, one of the things that are important is to find and select a repository. That's been spoken about multiple times today. So the NIH institutes and centers may designate a specific kind of repository, but they don't say that you have to have them specific ones in general sense, but each IC might have ones that they like. So, but they do recommend using a data type or a discipline specific repository if available. It makes it more accessible to people within your field. But other suitable options will include institutional repositories, PubMed Central, and generalist repositories. Again, we'll hear more about that in the next couple months, which will give us more examples of where the data can be deposited and what people are currently doing. So if you're going to find and to select a repository, they have a list on the NIH website, and there's NIH supported repositories that are filterable, and then there's a couple of general repositories that they mention here. But again, there's additional repositories that also come into play, and the NIH doesn't really have a specific need for you to use one unless your IC says so. So when should you share your data? Of course, we say always, but they say as soon as possible. So no later than the time of publication of findings in the peer-reviewed journal or at the end of the award, and that's actually whichever comes first. So if you publish before the award is completed or you end the award before you're able to publish, you still are required to deposit and share your data at that time. The limits of data sharing that specifically that they should actually maximize appropriate data sharing. So, and we've heard about this in our previous presentations as well. Justifiable, ethical, legal, and technical factors that might limit sharing include the informed consent, will not permit or limits the scope of data sharing use, privacy or safety of the research participants would be compromised, and available protections are insufficient. Explicit federal, state, local, or tribal law, regulation, or policy prohibits that disclosure, and restrictions imposed by an existing or anticipated agreements with other parties. So now, is the research also subject to other NIH data sharing policies? Well, they have a nice little decision tool as well. So you can go to this part of the website, and it will tell you whether or not that your work may be applicable to other policies. One of the policies that might come into play is the genomic data sharing policy. That's something that predates this data sharing policy and has more stringent requirements. So you don't have to have a separate policy, data sharing and management plan for genomic data sharing. It is now all included in one, but it has a higher level of requirements. So please make sure that you are complying with the genomic data sharing policy if you contain genomic data within your material. So the data sharing and management plan includes a single plan that addresses, like I said, both GDS and DMS policies. The DMS plans review plan assessments conducted by program staff, not by peer reviewers. The budget considerations, similar as before, detailed budget should include all allowable costs for all types. Compliance as well, as stated before, it's handled in accordance with the DMS policy, compliance and enforcement terms. And again, timing of data sharing. The GDS policy provides specific timelines. The latest possible time to submit data will be at the end of the award performance period, and that's specifically for genomic data sharing, whereas again, if you publish prior to that for your general data management and sharing plan, you need to share at that time. So again, to protecting privacy, which we just heard a lot about. So the best practices for protecting privacy when sharing human research participant data is to de-identify to the greatest extent while maintaining scientific utility, using the common rule and HIPAA privacy rule standards. So you should consider risks from information even when de-identified, and share identifiable data only when with that explicit consent, as we had seen before. Use agreements for transferring data should communicate limitations on that use, include prohibitions on re-identification or recontact, and understanding applicable legal protections and limitations on disclosure. Factors considered for that type of access: if it's shared through controlled access, if explicit limitations were put on data sharing within that consent, data pose particular risks to participants or groups, data cannot be sufficiently de-identified, or an unanticipated risks are discovered after that initial planning. So you may have to go back and put controlled access on your data if you then determine that there's an additional risk that has come up. Now, sharing through unrestricted access can occur if it's explicitly consented for unrestricted data sharing, and that de-identified and institutional review finds unrestricted sharing poses a very low risk. So they shared a little bit of information about this American Indian and American Native participant in data, and I won't go through too much of this, but just to say that you need to have specific inclusions for tribal sovereignty laws, regulations, and policies when you're working with these particular communities, to make sure that you engage with those tribes early and develop that data management and sharing plan before the research begins, and continue through research, and consider those protections necessary. And of course, everybody needs to agree to who will manage the data participating in this, specifically the tribe, researcher, and trusted third party. Now, some resources that they provided is this scientific data sharing website. This information is available here. That is where we got a lot of this material, so very grateful to have this as a resource. It's very rich. And they also have a frequently asked questions area, which is also really helpful for understanding this policy. But in general, if you have any specific questions, they encourage you to contact sharing@nih.gov. And again, all of this material will be on our website for your review in the future, and all the links associated with this presentation. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to end this part of the presentation and move on to our next one. Okay. Oops. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Allison Bateman-House, PhD, MPH, MPA. I'm sorry, MPH and MA. Oops, so sorry, just got out of that. 1 second. Here we go. She is a research assistant professor in the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU's Grossman School of Medicine and the NYU program in gene therapy and medical ethics. And we are so grateful to have her speak with us today on the ethics of data sharing. I will exit from here and please take it away.
Hi, I'm hoping that you can hear me and
We
see
can
my
hear you.
slides. Okay, great. So as mentioned, I'm Allison Bateman-House, and now my slides aren't advancing. Hello. There we go. Allison Bateman-House from New York University Medical Center, where I am an assistant professor of medical ethics. My disclosures are up in front of you right now, should you be interested in them. And parent project muscular dystrophy is highlighted because the majority of work related to this specific topic has been related to a project that was funded by Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. And I deeply appreciate that patient advocacy group supporting my work. So let me tell you a little bit about who I am, and then we'll get into the meat of this topic. So I think ethics is one of those things where everybody's like, yes, 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 ethics. And then if you ask them, what is that, or what would an ethicist do? Everybody sort of gives you a different answer. And there is no one canonical answer, but I'm just going to tell you why I was invited to speak with you today. So what I consider my job to be is to think about what has been done in the name of, research and scientific advancement and patient well-being, and what is being done right now, and then to think forward about what could be, both good, bad, indifferent, just, what could be done. And then how can we intervene now to prevent harms, to promote positive outcomes, and just to be creative and imaginative, not taking things for granted, but trying to think, what can we do? Who can we partner with, et cetera, to try to make things better? Barbara may have a completely different definition about what it is bioethicists do, but this is my self-described, my self-assigned job description. So I work in the areas of clinical trials, pediatrics, genetic medicine, and data safety monitoring board. And I have the pleasure of co-chairing a group called the Working Group on Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics, which you're welcome to look up if you're interested in our work. But what I do not specialize in, and what you may be noticing is missing from that list, is data sharing. So, obviously data sharing and responsible use of data is something that is connected to all of those topics. And there are ethicists who specialize in data ethics and medical privacy and other relevant topics. So I want to assure you, if you ask me a question today that I can't answer, I will reach out to colleagues and try to come up with the best answer I can and get back in touch with you outside of this forum. So please don't hesitate to ask, and I will do the best I can to answer you. So then again, what is bioethics? What is it that I am trying to do here? I think, as Barbara said earlier, that, when we're thinking about an issue, when we're thinking about, how to structure this trial or how to set up this research data sharing agreement or something, there's normally a continuum of ways that we can do things. And just looking at it, you can normally say, well, this is clearly bad. This clearly disadvantages somebody in a just, clearly illegal or unconscionable way. Sometimes it's easy to see something that's clearly good, that's a win-win for everybody. And even with my imaginative thinking hat on, I, don't see any problems with it. That's not as common as seeing things that are clearly bad. But the majority of things are in this middle, where they have desirable elements and undesirable elements, and you're kind of weighing them against each other and saying the undesirable elements outweigh the good versus in this one, the good outweighs the bad, where we think a trade-off is acceptable, etc. And in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, will this particular advance or effort or initiative or what have you advance generalizable knowledge? Because that's what we think research is. Will it harm trust in science, medicine, researchers, whatever? Because, perhaps a small gain in generalizable knowledge would not be worth it if it created distrust and lack of willingness to participate in research as a whole on a wider scale. And will it help patients? Will it advance health? Because that's what we're really here all about. And these things obviously would differ whether you're talking about an interventional study or a non-interventional study. And we really are here to talk about non-interventional studies. So in that case, it's much easier when you are thinking about setting up something from scratch. Who are going to be involved, who is going to have responsibility for what, who is going to be the beneficiary of what, under what rules is it going to be established, etc. It's much harder when you're going back and saying, wow, I have this data set, it was intended for patient treatment purposes or other such things, but now I'm thinking of perhaps trying to, glean data for research purposes from it. That is obviously harder to go back and try to retrofit things. So as Barbara said earlier, it really depends on the context, but this is the general framework that I apply to everything. And you have to think about it from the vantage point of all the different stakeholders. Obviously researchers are going to have a stake in things. Obviously patients are going to have a stake in things, but then there are people who are less obviously involved who may well think they have a stake in things. A payer may say, hey, we paid for those medical visits, hence we own that data. The data may be included in a medical record, and the institution may say, we own the medical record, or we own the IP on whatever comes from that medical record. So it gets complicated very fast, which I think when patient advocacy groups in particular are new to this, when they're like, let's start a registry, it very quickly becomes much more complicated than they thought. And I'm going to assume everyone here has at least had some experience of that and not go into that any further. So I just wanted to point out the National Academy of Medicine has a resource out called Sharing Health Data, the Why, the Will, and the Way Forward. And they just have this quote that I thought was really great, saying, evolving from a mindset of data guarding to data sharing is essential to meet society's potential. It is imperative for effectiveness, efficiency, and equity in health system performance. And I think if you took out health system performance to say, for advancement of science, for rapid drug development, for enhanced patient well-being, et cetera. You could put a lot of different things in there. And I think most of us on this webinar would probably agree that, yes, this is the crux of what needs to happen. We need to have this evolution from saying, I got the data, it's locked in this one place for this one use, to saying, let's use this effectively, et cetera. But then there's always this concern about data privacy. When I talk to people about, use of data, responsible use of data, sharing, et cetera, the first thing that people bring up is privacy, sometimes closely followed by confidentiality. But in my opinion, I think that's just because some people have lumped them together in their mind and don't even really stop to differentiate what the two are anymore. So data privacy, what is it? In my opinion, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a philosopher. I think when people are talking about data privacy, what they're really doing is they're recognizing that this data shouldn't just be handed out willy-nilly to, all comers, anyone who wants to use it, and that it ultimately belongs to those from whom it was derived. Now, I have this asterisk here because what does that mean? And as Barbara and I think somebody in the chat were starting to say, there's a zillion laws governing who has access to what, where things can be housed for how long and in, what capacity, et cetera. And honestly, what does it really matter who the data belongs to if it can't be accessed by that person? I can say my data is me, but if I don't know how to go get a hold of it or how to use it for my own ends, what does that mean? And especially financially, I mean, shouldn't I be able to say, if my data's mine, I can just sell it and be like, hey, you want my data? I'll sell it to you. We don't have a system like that. And even if I participate in a research study, I normally can't go and say, let me know what the results were. It's my data. Because it's felt to belong to the research sponsor or somebody else, et cetera. So respect for persons only goes so far in this setting. And what respect for persons is, really normally translated as is consent, as Barbara mentioned earlier. So we are on this seesaw, we're trying to share data responsibly, but at the same time, we're trying to guard data just as we always have. And I just want to note that, this is a sign of changing times, and we've had times change before. And if anything, this should make us feel liberated that, yes, it looks like a sticky wicket, and yes, there's lots of stakeholders and it's complicated and it'll cause us to pull our hair out for a while. But we really should feel like anything's possible as long as we come up with the idea and pursue it. So just to illustrate that, look at this. This is from 1916, the New York Times, and it's a list of who has polio, infantile paralysis, and there's names and the street address. You would never, ever, ever do this now. We went from this complete transparency of who has polio, who died from polio. Don't go near these people because you might end up contracting polio from them or their houses or their water sources or what have you, to a place where, medical privacy was paramount. You would not share patient information with anyone, let alone put it in the newspaper. And now we're shifting from this lockbox of medical privacy to we want to share data. We just need to figure out how. So this was just meant to be a little bit of encouragement to all of us, even as we navigate this, complex and confusing matter. And you can see the changing time in the fact that people want to contribute their genomic data to repositories, even though they know in the past there's been concern that the data may get out and may affect their employment, or police may have access to genomic data, et cetera. Patients now have access to the clinical notes in their medical records. And even with all of us, NIH's initiative to make the sort of genomic data bases available more inclusive. This is not only an idea of, hey, we want to bring data into the system so that research can continue and learn more, but it's an idea that this research, this government-funded research, needs to help everyone, not just the few who decided to participate in it. That's not what I mean, but the lucky few who happened to be involved. It was an idea that research actually needed to proactively reached out to say, we're trying to help everyone. So in short, when we talk about ethics, we tend to talk about risk and benefit. You can certainly see that conversation going on here. Is it a risk to share your data? Is it a benefit? Which one is it more of? And you're going to make that decision in a context-specific way. Where we need to illustrate respect for persons. We do that in part by trying to respect their data, but some people want to share their data. So we need to respect that choice as well and figure out some way to do that. And consent seems like a good vessel by which to do that. And then, of course, justice starts creeping into the conversation, normally under the guise of equity. For some reason, people seem much more comfortable to talk about equity, equity of access, equity of inclusion than justice. And then when you start talking about rare disease populations, which most of us on this call have dealt with, you really start having this conversation about what's for the community benefit, the community welfare, the common good, which personally delights my heart. But you know, it's much more common to say when it's a small community, when they're in touch with each other, you know, when there's unmet need, limited access, et cetera, for them to talk about, you know, all of us together, we need to decide what's best for us, than for, say, something like hypertension, where it's just, you know, a mass of people who probably don't even self-define as a community, let alone have a mechanism to really discuss amongst themselves what their preferences and wants are. So back to that sharing health data report that I mentioned, here's another quote. It is important to understand the very real risk and consequences of sharing data. And I think we all know that incredibly well. But just to underscore, here's an example from the area where I work, genetic medicine. This is a brand new article out, an imperative for public sharing of adverse events of gene therapy trials. This is something I've been calling for years, and so I was delighted to see this article come out. Because genetic therapies are often trialed in small numbers of patients. I mean, you might have 5 people or something be testing this candidate gene therapy. Adverse events at low or even medium frequencies may not be detected until more patients are treated. A critical lost opportunity to protect participants and to improve gene therapy development has arisen from a failure to effectively share these adverse events with the medical and scientific community at large. You know, people, they might die, they might have some other serious medical issue that seems related to the intervention, but nobody knew to look out for that, because when it had happened in another study of the candidate therapy, it wasn't shared. Currently, information about adverse events are siloed with individual trials, investigators, and sponsors, and only the FDA or parts of FDA has access to a high-level view of shared issues. And if only the FDA has knowledge of this, you know, FDA is bound by confidentiality in many cases. So, you know, that's not a incredibly public health centric way to prevent harms that could be prevented if there was a moral and policy oriented way set up to ensure these things were being shared proactively. You get it. I'm moving on. So we said data privacy, you know, is really this expression of respect for persons. But data privacy, I mean, I'm sorry, but respect for persons, and also this, you know, new idea of justice, equity that people are talking about, can really be demonstrated in other ways. And I wanted to point out, for example, minimization of burdens. And Barbara talked about this earlier. You know, why should a person have to go through the same procedures or the same screenings or natural history study measurements or what have you more than one time? If the data is there and multiple sponsors of research protocols want it, it would be so much less onerous for the patient to be able to have them all share that one value than having them do it over and over and over again. Not to mention, when you're doing it over and over again, if each sponsor is doing it by their own standards, you're going to end up, just for one person, having different data, which is just going to further complicate things. And I put justice into here because it's a burden to participate in a clinical trial. You know, I do a lot of oral interviews with trial participants and or parents of trial participants, and just hearing about, you know, what it takes to take off from work, to travel, to figure out how to, you know, stay in a hotel when the hotel is not a conducive environment for whatever the physical burdens of the condition are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you're going through this multiple times needlessly, you know, it is not a respect for persons. And it also, in terms of justice, means that only a certain percentage of that patient population are going to be able to do this. For people who don't have leisure time, extra money, et cetera, this is just going to be out of reach. And so you're going to end up skewed in terms of the patient population that you have data for. And so that's it for me. I was trying to go through really fast so we can get to the rest of our program, but you have my email address there. And like I said, if there's things you want me to go talk to other people about, don't hesitate, and I'll be glad to do so. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Allison. That was a great presentation. And Barbara and Krista as well. Thank you so much. I'm going to share just our little panel. Here we go. So we will now transfer to our panel discussion. Well, I'm not sure why it likes to reset on me. I'm sorry about that. But we'll go back to our panel discussion, and we have a couple of questions that have come in. I do want to say, let's see here, please. Okay. So I do want to say we do have some interesting questions here, and we also have a decent amount of feedback previously. So when we look at, sorry, I don't have all of my things set up here. 1 second. Okay, so when we look at the questions, we actually had an interesting statement I think is really important to start off with, was that we have a statement that says we still have an issue with data guarding in rare disease. As a patient advocacy group, we've had our very expensive biotech lawyer look at this contract with our academic partner for the natural history study that they are paying for to ensure the patient community could still retain some of the data. They're concerned that the data could go and die at the academic partner, as we've seen happen in other natural history study investigations. So maybe this is a great place to start. And if we could get all of our speakers on camera, if you would like. And so everybody, we can do either or if we would like, if we just want to, now that we know who everybody is, I'm going to stop sharing and then have everybody on video. Okay, great. So maybe we can start with that there, to say, what if you think you've done everything right and that you have everything in line? We also saw this in the Cure GM1 efforts, and Krista, I know you've seen this a lot as well. Is there anything that can be done kind of in the interim to make sure that this doesn't go and die in an academic area and be inaccessible? Is there any advice that we might have for that group?
I mean, go ahead, Allison.
I was just going to say, before people give like actual practical advice, which I'm not going to offer, I would just say from an ethics angle, research on people, as I said earlier, is a burden, and it does entail risk. And so when you do research on people, yes, you may be benefiting the individual participant. Not likely, especially not in an observational trial, but you may. But the promise that we're offering is that you're going to collect this data that hopefully will offer long-term community benefit. And then if the data gets sequestered somewhere, say your PI dies and nobody else has access to the database or something, you've broken that fundamental ethical, sort of trade-off that you've made with the community. So that's not going to win legal battles. And, like I said, I'm going to let the rest of y'all offer practical advice. But that's just the sledgehammer that I'm always using on people, is that you made a promise to people that their data was going to be used for the benefit of other patients and or themselves. And data that is not shared is not used, and you did not fulfill your promise.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say that in fact, that is one of the key impetus for this workshop. I mean, we have to me, as the scientific director for CPLD, I thought that, so my initial charge was to identify a biomarker that was cross-cutting across initially all, and then several of the lysosomal diseases. And obviously that's a daunting task that, far exceeds my capability, although we're working very diligently on that. But to me, the data guarding has really been something that, because I was previously in the opposite of rare disease, I was in chronic disease, and we could get data on, I did pediatric obesity and type 2 diabetes. We could get data anywhere and everywhere. So it was a daunting, it was a surprising and daunting task, and it continues to be. And I think that, one of the things is there's a couple of things that each of you touched on, and the consenting process, that also has become part of one of the barriers, but just the prioritization of open collaboration from the beginning. I know that there's initial natural history studies that are just beginning. But this type of dialogue, I think, is at least enhancing the ethics, as you mentioned, Allison, and what we're trying to do here. And this is, at the individual levels minimally, but at the community level maximally. And I mean, that's again the impetus for this webinar series.
Can I just ask a question, Allison? When you said data guarding, did you mean basically data over possessiveness, which is the way this is reading, or did you mean data guarding so that it would be released under clear conditions which were responsible as methods to steward that data?
Yeah, I mean, great question. Obviously, the first.
Possessiveness.
Yeah, over possessiveness.
Oh, over possessiveness. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
I mean, what we want is the latter, where with a proper structure and rules in place, everybody has access for their specific purposes.
Because I think it's an unfortunate term, because it can be interpreted in both ways. I am guarding, I am stewarding the data appropriately, or you can't have it, it's mine. So interesting.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
mean, I will blame the National Academy of Medicine, because that's where it came from. But
Yeah.
when I was flipping through my slides this morning, I was like, oh, I wish I had changed that over to something else.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I clearly am an optimist. That's what I learned today.
Well, you heard me saying I was optimistic about the possibilities for change too. And for other people who have heard me talk before, that is uncharacteristically optimistic for me too, who normally is like, the sky is falling. So
The sky is falling.
You and I both are optimistic on this particular topic.
Yeah, and I would just like to say that this is something, and you're right, terminology is important, and we really should be careful about our language here. Most importantly, because it does give the wrong impression to the people that might be entering this space about the protection of data versus the lack of release of data, which I think that these are the two different things we're talking about. That is what we've heard from the
Can I
patient
just say,
community.
Kara, so
Yes,
I
please.
think we could change data guarding to like data hoarding and think of like,
Hoarding. Yeah,
you know, like a
Yeah,
dragon being
I
like,
think that's great.
this is my treasure, nobody else can have it. We don't want that. So
Well, excellent, because I will make a quick change to some summary slides I already created. But this is a really important aspect for us to understand, because this is actually what drove most of our conversations today, was that our families would come to us and say, now using the term data hoarding, which sounds very accusatory, but at the same time, sometimes that is done for reasons that are a little bit out of people's control. They don't necessarily don't want to share the data, they just don't know how to share the data, or they don't have the economic wherewithal to make that happen. We've found that in the collaborative work that we're doing now, and I think Krista can speak to the same, that no matter what people might want to do after they've decided that it is something that they're choosing to do, there are a lot of additional barriers that come into play. Again, the personnel that might be around, the funding that might be available for that. And we've actually had a couple of different comments from some people in our surveys before that I wanted to interject into this as well, that, you know, the funding for this kind of work is not here. And how does that come about? If we can encourage data sharing as much as we want, yes, the NIH has now included an aspect of data sharing that does have a budget, but that's for going forward. And also, it's difficult to understand those long-term challenges of what it'll take to deposit that data in the repository and then to manage that repository for a long time. Some of our groups that we will be highlighting earlier do have really interesting setups where there is a fee to use the data depending on who you are and what kind of company you're coming from or sponsor yourself. And that actually goes to support the infrastructure going forward. You're not paying for the data in the past. You're actually just having a user fee to support the infrastructure going forward. So there's a lot of really interesting economic approaches, but I agree that there is not enough funding in this area specifically for groups that are really willing to do it. And the more that we've come together, the more we've heard that.
if I can just
Does any-
share a
Please.
vignette just to point out the silliness of things. I consult a lot for pharma and biotech, and I'm in academia. And when I say consult, it could be like a 15-minute phone call, but there's paperwork to be signed ahead of time. And both the pharma, biotech, and the university have in their paperwork that whatever comes out of this is going to belong to them. And I'm like, well, doesn't it belong to me? It's my thoughts. Like, it's 15 minutes of thoughts on a phone. Like, there's not any paper
It doesn't.
there's no data being produced. And it'll take weeks to get paperwork signed because people are arguing about who this data belongs to. And I'm like, we could have just talked on the phone by the, you know, like, but yeah, so the reason I'm saying this is I think that there is just a innate possessiveness of entities at this point to, we want to claim ownership of something because it may end up being valuable down the road, and we will kick ourselves if we did not claim ownership. Barbara, do you agree or disagree? Or
I think that's true. I also think it's true that many investigators that I work with overvalue what they think they have. And it's one thing about sort of research data, but it's another, and it's about ideas and thoughts, which I think are really complicated, Allison. We should talk about that at some point offline, because I think you're right, but it's very hard to get that concept across the finish line. And what I found for myself is that you have to be thoughtful about what you say and don't say, because they do own it once it's said and it's out there. I think that just to pivot for a second, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A about if patients or families want to share their data, how can they do so? And I think that's a really important question for us to try to answer. I do think there's no inhibition to sharing the same data multiply. You're not giving it to one place and saying, you know, you now own it, and I can't share my own data elsewhere. I also think that there are a lot of contracts that, you know, plain people like myself can't read with any sort of understanding of what the terms of that contract would be. And that one valuable thing that one could do is come up with sort of here's the patient contract. So when they're giving the data to an institution or to a company, it doesn't start with the company's contract or the institution's, it comes from the patient. And that's sort of turning it a little bit on its head. But I do think that is something, you know, that sort of CPATH or people could start to think about, so that, okay, you can sign this, but you're also signing mine. And here's the letter of commitment that when I want to withdraw it, I can withdraw it, or, you know, you're going to share it as I dictate, whatever it is. And I think that's something that the patient advocacy community should be thinking about. That's one thing, but I also think that is also an area where the patient advocacy organizations should be forward thinking in how they support their participants, so that there is a understanding that if they're confronted with a, you know, here's a piece of paper, and can you read it? There's an ability for someone else to sort of come forward and say, let me help you read that and tell you what it says. That's going to be tough, but I think in the end, it will serve the community well. And it's not that the Advocacy Association would need to say, you know, this, you could have plausible deniability. We're not lawyers, we're not this, but here's what you're agreeing to in plain language. So the other thing is, I think, you know, I do think that the time is changing, and that we should be able to find ways to help each other share data that you want to. I do worry at times, having had pediatric friends of mine now cross the threshold to adulthood, that their data is out there and their identifiability is out there, and they are identified with that disease and can't escape it. And it is something that I think parents, and I know this, in really wanting to do the best they can for their child who is you know, affected by a condition or disease, genuinely are sharing it on behalf of their child and the future. But it's sharing something that in the end is on behalf of the child, not themselves. It's a complicated thing. And I have one friend who's actually has a 17-year-old who's been affected with a condition her entire life. And none of us know what it is. All we know is that she's affected by a condition. And I have great respect for it, you know, but initially I was like, but you're a friend of mine, I'm a doctor, what's going on? And now I feel like it's yours, you know, and I value the fact that she stood tall for 17 years on this.
Just to pick up on that really quickly, and it's a little beyond what we're talking about today, but I think it's very important, especially now that we have transformative therapies that may make some of these diseases undetectable in adulthood. I think that is something we need to think about in a really serious way, about how, after we have shared that information within these studies, within social media, within our own support groups, how do we then give these pediatric, then adult patients, the ability to control that message going forward. And how we have that discussion when they're young is definitely something we need to think about a lot more to protect them in the future. So thank you for bringing that up. I did want to just touch on another thing that you had mentioned, which was having a toolkit for, or a consent that comes from patients. And that is, I think, adds perfectly to what we're trying to achieve here, which was trying to empower the patients and patient community with just even mentioning that data sharing is important to them, that this was not a discussion walking into a trial that anybody would even think to have. And we only ever ended up having that when they could not access that data, or they did not have the ability to share or to utilize it if it was a natural history study or a registry with other organizations in the future that might be then developing a drug, or et cetera. So in that respect, what we were trying to do was just start the conversation by saying, here after, and at the conclusion of this workshop, what we're hoping to have is that toolkit that we can share with the patient community, both in lay language that they can understand, but also that they can present to the sponsors when they enter those studies to say, this is important to us, and here are some ways that you can do it. Is it going to be perfect? No, because every single organization does things slightly differently. There's a lot of different aspects of it, which we will get into detail over the next couple months. But I think it is a great start, and I love the idea of pairing that with a consent from the patient. And what that looks like exactly legally, I think that will take a lot more time to consider. But as a complementary aspect to this, I think that would be an amazing output, and maybe setting for the next set of data workshops. Do we have any additional questions or answers or discussion on these topics, or should we move on? No?
Move on
Okay.
to additional questions in the chat.
Exactly.
Yeah, go
yes,
ahead.
Please.
Go
Yeah. So we have one that is a discussion about GUIDs, the globally unique IDs that are being used for studies to minimize participant exhaustion, but also to, at least we've seen in a lot of our groups, that our patients are participating in 3, 4, 5 different natural history studies to move things forward. And we're actually seeing a challenge with that when it comes to how do we rectify all those patients so we're not counting them more than once. So could our panel here maybe speak to GUIDs and how that's used, and maybe what you recommend?
Allison, do you want to start, or Krista?
I'm not familiar with this. I know of work happening with phase 1 patients, but that's obviously not this.
So I can speak only from my experience with the NPC community. And the INDPR, the International Niemann-Pick Disease Registry, just this month released their GUID live toolkit or tool for NPC, which will be very helpful. Again, largely because somewhat because of the patient burden, but also because of the visits between different clinical sites that will allow for optimizing the quality data while eliminating some of the duplicates that could confound the data analysis. So, that's just from the NPC community that will link the international data, and particularly with some of our collaborators stateside. And so that's really been a great thing for the NPC community. I think that there's some other activities that are along that, but I only know that I can only speak for the NPC community. Barbara?
So just to say, the GUIDs, the Global Universal ID for a person or participant, is a single number or set of identifiers that are coded in such a way that you have one code or one number for all your activities, and then you can find the data more easily. You can deduplicate the data. You can combine it so that if you're in one health system initially and then you go to another health system, you still know that that is the same person, even if they're not named Susan Smith, So I think that it's a very good idea. I do think that we have to make sure that we have privacy protections in place. I can see this being so abused, you have no idea. So that is my concern, that right now we have all the motivation for doing it and none of the legal protections against misuse of data. And, that is true when you look at, sort of the change in our perspective on identifiers of people that has occurred now, on things like the tolerance for unhoused people or migrant people who are migrating, or any other socially vulnerable population. I think it's a risk. So I am totally on board with all of its advantages, and totally scared of all of the implications. And I think that one thing we should all do is push for better differential privacy techniques so that people cannot be identified without their sort of lock and key to be able to know who that person is. So
Well,
I am
thank you.
conservative.
I would like to ask if there's 30 seconds maybe from each of our presenters.
30-second wrap up thoughts. So I think that I'll just add that I think this is a really well-timed and wonderful conversation to have. And that the more we can bring it to the participants themselves and the public, the better informed we're going to be about where people want to be, and where we should be as a group and as a nation in terms of policies in this way. So I think this is just what we should be doing.
I'll just say again that I am uncharacteristically optimistic about the fact that we are going to get to a positive place with this. I don't dare venture how long that's going to take, but I feel like all the incentives are there for this to work out, and we are smart enough to do it.
I'll just, I understand and appreciate the need for protection of the participants, but I also, I really feel that the opportunities for drug development in lysosomal disease in particular are dependent on data sharing. And so we have to do our due diligence, but we also have to collaborate widely and respectfully to be able to have positive outcomes for the patients. That's what it's about.
Excellent. And I apologize for my little background noise there. But I will just conclude with our conclusions right here. I'm going to share. As soon as I will get better at this as the weeks go on, I swear. Let's see here. Okay, so I'm just going to share these conclusion slides. And as you see, I've updated so that sharing is greater than data hoarding. We will maybe use that, or maybe a slightly different a word from that going forward. But we have gotten a lot of great feedback today, and we're so grateful for our presenters, everybody for their expertise and their time, for all of our participants for their attention, both before, during, and soon to be after this presentation. We look forward to your feedback and for ways to make this the most rich experience it can be. And I think we're off to a great start today. So here's some of the summaries, again, that the NIH data sharing policy is required for those funded studies. And I did want to mention, actually, that there is a another policy associated with clinical trials that was started in 2016 that requires you to deposit or to put information onto clinicaltrials.gov and to have updates. However, that is not for non-interventional studies, so it doesn't qualify there. So this is, again, enforces the need for this kind of sharing. We know that consent language determines the study's data sharing ability, and we got into a lot of great detail about that and data sharing privacy. We've heard a lot about essential need for biomarker identification, understanding disease progression, identification of patients for early intervention, and potential for accelerated approval, giving less costly trials, getting therapies to patients more quickly. We also heard that natural history studies and sharing them with those registries can accelerate drug development by making the most of every investment in patient contribution, moving science forward, because that really does lift all boats. And during this interesting time that we are in now, where funding might be a little bit of a challenge, we need to really take care of the resources that we have and make the most of them. We can help to identify disease-related biomarkers in those studies, and again, genotype-phenotype relationships. And there's the potential for the placebo-controlled studies to be unnecessary if you use a natural history as a comparator. And we really look forward to that opportunity in a lot of these diseases, specifically in our rare diseases. So just want to say, together we can help to empower the patient community to advocate for the legacy that they deserve. And we're going to provide the sponsors the opportunity to support those communities, honor their contributions, and continue to advance science. And really for the best opportunity to find the right drug for the right patient at the right time. And again, I thank everybody for their contributions today. Just want to say we have more case studies coming up. We're going to get into some really interesting discussions with examples from different sponsors about how they shared, and then getting into data sharing collaborators. But we need more. So please scan this QR code, give us some feedback, and tell us if you have a study you want to share with us. We want to hear that, whether that's on our workshop itself, or you can set it, we can arrange something to be anonymized that can be just submitted to the publications that we will present later. And we'll have a lot of opportunity to have these discussions. So we need as many different studies as we can, so we can help as many sponsors and families that we can moving forward. So again, I just want to thank everybody. And here is our information. Krista and I, we look forward to seeing you in 1 month on March 24th, where we hear our first set of case studies on proactive data sharing. Thank you so much for everybody's contributions today, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you.